Well, good afternoon and welcome to another River Landing Conversation. I'm Jim Kalaki and I'm here along with my good friend Kay Heflin to have a lovely discussion with our good friend John Scroggins. John, welcome.
Glad to be here, thank you.
I'm so glad you're a part of this series, and we're looking forward to a nice engaging chat for the next
Thank you, Jim.
while.
I'm glad to be here, and I just want to tell you, the Furl Working Group and you and Helen Shields before Kay, this is a wonderful thing that you're doing. And I always tell people, if we've got 625 people, residents at River Landing, you've got 625 unique stories and amazing backgrounds. And I'm glad to be one of them.
Well, what a treat to have you. Gosh.
Nice
Kay.
introduction. Nice introduction. John, why don't we start kind of following your life path down on where you were born and grew up and go from there.
Okay. I was born in Memphis, Tennessee at the Baptist Hospital, and we lived in Memphis for a long time, at least until I was about 12 years old. We moved around inside of the city, and then finally we moved just outside of the city to a little town called Fraser. I really enjoyed that move. I was about 10 when we moved there, and the biggest and best part of it probably is that right next door, the Childers family had moved in. The Childers family had 4 boys, and in my family we had 7 children, all about the same ages. Every afternoon and all through the summertime and every Saturday, we would have the best ball games you can imagine between the Childers and the Scroggins. So that was my young years. I moved to Texas for a little while because my grandmother was there. And if I had enough money to ride the Greyhound bus, I would catch the bus from Memphis to North Texas, Wichita Falls, which is north of Dallas. And I'd stay with my grandmother for a couple of months. Always enjoyed that. It was just my grandmother and me, no other siblings, and I kind of had all the attention that I wanted. So that was basically my growing up until I went into the Army.
Did you go in right after high school?
No, actually, I thought I was a little too smart for high school, so I dropped out when I was 16, almost 17, and I tried to join the Army. But the recruiter said, you have to be 17 years old, and one of your parents has to sign for you. And I said, okay, I could probably get either one of my parents to do that. And so on my 17th birthday, April the 15th, 1963, the recruiter comes and knocks on my door. And he says, John, are you ready to go into the Army? I said, yes, I am. And so I joined the Army on my birthday when I was 17 in 1963. I was an enlisted man for 3 years. And I thought the Army was great. It was discipline. I got uniforms. They paid me $79 a month. And so my father signed the papers that night and took me to the bus station the next morning, and off we were to Fort Polk, Louisiana. It was April, and then May and June. It was hot in Louisiana during those months. It was a 12-week course. It was rigorous and kind of tough. Every morning getting up early, never missing a meal, and going to bed late. And it was all kinds of duties that you can imagine. I guess I was kitchen police, KP duty. I was cleaning up the barracks. I was doing all kinds of different things, in the Army. Plus I was learning some skills. So after about 6 months of going between Fort Polk, Louisiana, Fort Hood, Texas, Fort Jackson, South Carolina, then I finally got my first assignment, and it was an assignment to Germany. I was thrilled. I'd never traveled in my life except the Greyhound bus between Memphis and Wichita Falls. So my time to get on the ship, we were going over the Atlantic by ship during those days was December the 30th was the day that I got on the ship. I can still remember climbing that ramp. It was very steep, and all you had was your duffel bag over your shoulder and your kit bag in your other hand, and climb up into the ship. It was huge. They had 3 ships that were left over from World War II. The USS Patch, the USS Buckner, and the USS Rose. This ship that I was getting on was the Buckner. It was a 10-day trip across the Atlantic. It was very exciting. The seas were rough and the ship was back and forth and up and down. And, but I was 17, so I thought I was having a good time, you know? So it took 10 days to get across. Everybody on the ship had to have a job. The bays were full of soldiers. There must have been 3,000 soldiers on the ship. But my job was, I was the projectionist. Every morning I would show a movie titled The Great Escape, and every evening I would show Irma la Douce. That was my only job. I had the best job on the ship. And so I arrived in Germany. Shall I continue with this tale?
Sure, yes.
Great.
I arrived in Germany and the port of Bremerhaven, which is very far north of Germany. And then we all took various trips from there on buses or on trains, mostly on trains. And we would, I was on a train for about 6 hours going to southern Germany, a town named Pirmasens. And that's the first time I'd ever been on a train. So I ended up in Pirmasens and got assigned to the 79th Combat Engineers as a signal person. Some of those months when I was traveling around from Fort Polk to Fort Hood to Fort Jackson, I took a battery of tests, and they determined what your military occupational specialty is, your MOS. And so my specialty was a signal person. And I could operate radios, I could repair radios, and it was a great job. I enjoyed it, and it was a good unit, the 79th Combat Engineers. So I stayed in the Army at that post for the next 2.5 years, and then when it came time for me to get discharged, the 15th of April, 1966, just as I turned 20, I decided I wasn't going to go back to Memphis right away. I decided that I would get discharged in Europe. I got a passport, I got a youth hostel card, and when I got discharged, I traveled around Europe for about 6 months. I had already gotten my GED diploma and had already applied and been accepted to Midwestern University in Texas and Memphis State in Memphis, Tennessee. So I had 6 months to travel around Europe. I was single. I had a little bit of money in my pocket because I just didn't have things to spend money on. So I had saved it. And I bought a rucksack, an old canvas, not old canvas, it was a brand new rucksack made out of canvas. And I went to the post exchange and bought a small American flag about like this, 5 by 8, something like that. American flag, which with my sewing kit, I sewed onto the side of my backpack. And when I was hitchhiking around, that was my mode of travel, I would set that backpack right by the road, and when people would see my American flag, a lot of folks would stop and pick me up and take me to wherever I was going, or I would go to wherever they were going. And the reason they stopped is I'm sure they wanted to practice their English. Mm-hmm. I think some were surprised a little bit that my English was like Tennessee drawl. And so I understood about as much as they understood from me. But that was a lot of fun. I got a little education during those 6 months, just traveling around the places that I never would have gone to. And then I came back to the United States and started school at Midwestern in North Texas.
Let's stay in Europe for a second, both in the Army and in this traveling around. How did you deal with different languages? Did you learn some language?
I
or some
learned
German or something?
I learned a good deal of German.
Yeah.
I could manage German pretty well. I learned a little bit of French. I could get things to eat. I could get locations. I could find the men's room. I could find my way around, the countryside. And that's really all I needed.
Yeah.
A lot of people, even then, spoke English,
Yeah.
so I'd get by with it.
Neat. Neat.
So in the fall of 1966, I started as a freshman at Big Western. And while I was still a freshman, I saw this beautiful girl, a blonde, and she was talking to a friend of mine. And her name was Katie Scroggins, or Katie Ingmeyer, soon to be Katie Scroggins. So I met Katie, and we started going out, and as things turn out, about a year from that time, we decided to get married, and we did. And she was ahead of me in school because we were both basically the same age, and I had already spent 3 years in the Army. So she graduated while I was still either a senior freshman or a sophomore. And she worked as a teacher, and I always had a job, and I had the GI Bill, which wasn't much, but it helped. And we managed to get by. And before I graduated, we had 2 little girls. And guess where my first assignment was? Germany.
Well,
So when I got commissioned as a second lieutenant, we were off to Germany. But while I was still a cadet, I went to the airborne course and got qualified as a parachutist. And I also, at the same time, right behind the airborne course, I went to the ranger course and got qualified as a ranger. The ranger is a leadership school, and it's hard. I've always said the Rangers know how to take the fun out of everything, and they did. So I'm qualified. I'm pretty qualified second lieutenant, and we go off to Berblingen, Germany. And we did not have a place on post yet for us to live, so we had to live on the economy, as they called it, in the little town of Berblingen. And it was really to our benefit to live there for a year, because our oldest daughter, Debbie, was 6, and we got to send her to a German school. So she went to a German school. She learned how to speak German very quickly. And on the weekends, I would take her down to the local store, and I'd say, Debbie, tell the gentleman that I would like a 6-pack of beer and some of those rolls. And she would tell him in German. I think the person at the grocery store thought I was like deaf and dumb or something. Anyway, that was a good year to be off of the post. I had to drive into the post every morning, of course, and it was a busy time. We had a great unit. We met a lot of friends. I made my way up through the ranks from a first lieutenant, from a second lieutenant to a first lieutenant. And I really enjoyed the leadership challenges of being an officer. And in my view, I had a leg up on my fellow officers in that I had 3 years of enlisted time. I understood the Army. I understood the needs of enlisted soldiers. And I knew that a lot of enlisted soldiers were married and they have families. And now that I'm an officer, I have a responsibility not only to take care of the soldier, but be aware of his family needs as well. And Katie, by the way, was very good at that part of it, because her father had been a West Point graduate in 1937. And so she'd spent her whole life associated with the Army. And now she's the proud wife of a first lieutenant. So that was our first assignment. And I'll just continue on, I guess, unless you have other questions.
well, I was just going to make the observation. I was going to ask you about what you just talked about, because, as you know, I was an enlisted man about the same time in the Army. We weren't together in the Army, but ever since we've started conversing here, I've always thought what a fabulous asset you had in terms of knowing what enlisted life was about. Because as I know, at least in my experience, there were a number of second lieutenants who did not know much about enlisted life and did not sometimes care that much about it, and made life even more miserable than.
Well, it was a great advantage, Jim.
Yeah.
And another part of the advantage is what I just mentioned about Katie. She knew
Absolutely.
the Army.
Yeah.
She knew their family needs that need
Yeah.
to be, taken care of as well. So when we would deploy, and we deployed a lot, I was in the infantry. I was a second lieutenant of infantry, and we deployed a lot. And when we did, the wives would take care of each other, back at post. Okay, let's see, where was I? Now, after we left Germany, we came back to Fort Benning, Georgia, where I had to go through the advanced course with all the other officers that were my age and my rank. That was at Fort Benning, and I went out to the Ranger Training Brigade and asked if I could be assigned there when I got relieved from the school. And since I had been an honor graduate of the Ranger course when I went through, they took me on as an instructor, which was another great time. We got to stay at Fort Benning for another 3 years. And that was nice and settled down. We loved Fort Benning, Georgia, and our kids loved the schools there, and we had a nice set of quarters on post. Okay, and so I was training Rangers for about 3 years. It was a great job. It was hard work, not so much for me, but for the Rangers. And it was physical, very physical. I was airborne qualified, Ranger qualified, of course. And when we trained the Rangers, those that had been through jump school, they jumped as part of their exercises and training. And then not too long after that assignment was drawing to an end, the hostages were taken in Iran. And that situation ended in a bad way in that the operation called Desert One happened in the desert, and a C-130 aircraft ran into a helicopter. And a lot of Rangers and special operations people were killed as a result of that. Well, anyway, we only had 2 Ranger battalions at that time. The 1st Ranger Battalion in Savannah and the 2nd Ranger Battalion in Washington State. So I volunteered to go there, and I was accepted. And I spent another 3 years in the Rangers with the 1st Ranger Battalion. And that were exciting times. We were doing all kinds of great training with special operations forces, the Delta Force and the SEAL team, and special operations air component Air Force people, and it was great training. But then for the rest of my career, I went back and forth from the 82nd Airborne Division to the 75th Rangers. And I did that until I retired in 2002. And I had great jobs. I was always either the commander or the operations officer. And those are the 2 best jobs you could possibly have in a unit. And it was fun work, and it was great to hang out with all those young guys that wanted to do the things that we were doing, That's what they joined the Army for. They wanted to do those kinds of things. We almost always trained at night. We did a lot of jumps from airplanes and helicopters. We did rappelling. We did lots of long marches. And it was a fun career. It really was. And I got promoted. I kept getting promoted right along on time, that I should be promoted. And before I knew it, I was not only commanding a platoon and a company, but I was selected for battalion command. So I commanded a battalion in the 82nd Airborne Division, which is a really good job. And then they appointed me as the 82nd Airborne Division Operations Officer, which is another very good job. And after that, lo and behold, I got selected to be a brigade commander. So I commanded a brigade in the 82nd, and another very good job.
So were you at Fort Bragg during that time?
I was. I was almost always at Fort Bragg or the Rangers. And they've developed, after Desert One, they decided that National Command authorities decided that they needed another Ranger battalion, so they formed another one at Fort Benning, and that they needed a regimental headquarters. So now they had a regimental headquarters and 3 battalions of Rangers, which is a pretty good capability for special operations. And at one time, I went to Fort Benning again to be the operations officer for the 75th Rangers, which was another very good job, you know. They still took the fun out of everything, but at least I had a good job. Okay. So when I finished commanding a brigade, and I'm already, you know, I have about 25 years in the service by that time, and I was selected to go be the assistant division commander for the 101st Assault Airborne Battalion at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Another nice job. And I did that for about 7 months. And then Katie and I decided that we had 5 grandchildren that all lived fairly close to Fort Bragg. So we decided that it's time to get out, build a house, and enjoy our grandkids. So we did. And in 2002, I retired. We built a nice house on a lake. And I taught all 5 grandchildren how to bait their own hook and how to catch fish and take them off, off of the hook. It was fun.
It sounds like, John, this is just, I've not heard you lay out your career in this kind of detail before, though I do bits and pieces of it. But it's, when you think of, when most people, I think, at least, let me put that, when I think of sort of high-level military types, which obviously you ended up being, I often think of the Pentagon and that whole part of the military thing. And what you've described is about as far removed at that level from the Pentagon than I can probably imagine.
Yeah, if you chose the term a dirty boots soldier, that would be me.
Yeah.
I never served in the Pentagon, and I stayed in the fields a lot, and I enjoyed it. That's where I belonged, really, you know. So that was my career. That's pretty quick for a career.
So besides teaching your grandchildren to fish after you retired, did you develop any other hobbies or interests?
I did. I was always a hunter. I was always a fisherman. And I always had a boat. And finally, some weeks ago, I finally sold my boat, and it's finally the last boat I'll ever own. I'm happy to say. So, but I was an outdoorsman. My career was outdoors. Mm-hmm. My hobbies were outdoors. So those were my hobbies.
When did you and Katie move here to River Landing?
We came here in 2018, July of 2018. And we got a 3-bedroom cottage on Thistleburn Lane, and we love it there. It's a great site where you overlook the 9th fairway and the little pond there. And while we moved in, they started building the clubhouse, and I watched every single brick go up in that clubhouse. And it was.
How did you find River Landing?
Some friends of ours that live here, the Horners, had already moved here, and they knew we were looking around for a place to retire. And so they recommended we come out here and visit. We did, and we liked it immediately. We put down the requisite monies, and it took about 3 years, but we finally got the call and said, we've got a place for you. And so we moved in. And since then, I know you're going to ask me this anyway.
Yes.
Since then, I helped get started with a small group of people, the River Landing Bird Club. And it's my life's work right now. I mean, I love being in the Bird Club. I like being in charge of the Bird Club. And I think we're up to 130 members. We have a bluebird trail, which is really good and productive. We have 65 bluebird nest boxes. And we have trail leaders that check them during the season once every week, and we keep tabs on how many eggs we have in each box, how many babies there and how many actually fledge and become, a new family of bluebirds. We also have Carolina chickadees, the tree swallows, the tufted titmouse, and the brown-headed nuthatch. Those are the birds that we target. But we have a lot of luck with bluebirds.
And you're feeding all that data that is collected each week to Cornell.
Yeah, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology accepts our data, and one of our members, Roger Cooper, sends that data in every week on the computer so that they can keep up with our particular bird club. It's a lot of fun. The people that come to our presentations, and we have a presentation here in the NPR almost every month. We have guest speakers from all around North Carolina that are ornithologists, professors. They talk about trees, they talk about flowers, they talk about bees, butterflies, and especially birds. And it's very entertaining. And you can also watch our presentations on 1390. But if you come to the meeting in person, you could get a draw prize. So that's an enticement.
There you go.
All right.
And some of those prizes, I know, are
They're fun.
to be envied,
Yes.
or the winners are to be envied, because they're excellent. If the details were taken care of, John, who are 3 or 4 people in sort of all of time that you'd like to spend
The
a
first,
bit of time with?
I was a history minor. I was an English major and a history minor. But the most interesting part of American history to me was right after the American Revolution. I would like to spend some time with President Thomas Jefferson. There were exciting things going on in America during that time. Jefferson brokered the deal for the Louisiana Purchase, almost doubled the size of the United States. He sent Lewis and Clark across the United States to the Pacific, trying to find a waterway across the United States. That's the kind of president he was. He was forward thinking. At that same time, Napoleon was the Emperor of France. Exciting times. So that's a guy that I would like to spend some time with. Another person who was alive at that same time would be John James Audubon. I'd like to go to the field with Audubon.
Yeah,
Spend some time.
that would be a trip.
He was all over the United States and South America and shooting birds. That's the only way he could capture, what they look like and what kind of birds they were, and categorizing all those birds. And I think I'd like to spend a good field trip with Audubon.
I think you're the first person who's ever chosen Audubon to be one of the guests.
I hope so. He'd like to hang out with me too, I think. He'd say, you're good in the field. And the last guy, I think, I don't know if anybody else would choose him, but Mark Twain. Again, early part of America developing right after the Civil War, and the life along the Mississippi as depicted by Mark Twain, I think he'd be a good guy to hang out with.
As you think back on your time so far at River Landing, have there been any surprises or unexpected happenings aside from the Bird Club, of course, is clearly a huge
I
part
do
of
enjoy
your
the Bird Club, and I think
thing,
River Landing deserves a Bird Club, and so do the residents here, and I think they like it, and we're doing very well with that. But I'll tell you, I've been pleasantly surprised at how Tom Smith keeps getting a great staff, and every time you turn around, whoever you're working with on the staff is absolutely fabulous at what they do, and that's fun. It's what we expected, but now that we're here for 4 years and realize that's what we got, that's pretty exciting. There's a lot to do here. There's all kinds of social things to do. Both Katie and I play golf. We enjoy that. It's nice to be in a place that has its own little golf course. We both play cheer volleyball. You know that's a challenging game. We have a lot of fun with it. And we socialize, and mainly we have good neighbors, good friends, and we like to have dinner with them. We like to hang out and have a glass of wine with them. And we couldn't be happier than to be at River Landing.
Great.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us,
I'm glad to be here. I thought,
sharing your story.
yeah, well, it's a short story, but it's my story. So there you are.
They're all precious to us because they are ours.
Okay.
Yes.
Again, thanks for having me, Jim. Okay, I enjoyed it.
Great. John, thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you all for joining us, and we invite you back next week for another River Landing conversation. Good afternoon.